Well, let's go ahead and get started and turn to Genesis 35. I'd like to say, Steve, you made the comment about the, what do you call it, a verbal salad or?
A word salad.
Word salad. Well, I think we would all want to express our appreciation, and you're free to give a word salad whenever you want to here. Really appreciate what you and, of course, Everett do for us, leading us in our singing. Mentioned racism, and there's, I don't know if any of you have Netflix, but there's a really good series, I think it's an exceptional series, produced by Tom Hanks called The 60s. And it really helped me put together connect some of the dots behind the whole, the racial intensity of the 60s. I was a kid back then, but it really helped me to do that. So it's a good investment to look at that series just to see. That's only one of the topics, of course, but it was well worth the time. So let's turn to, we're at Genesis 35, and believe it or not, we're actually starting to wrap up. Now starting, we're, that's a loose phrase, but we really are, we're a chapter or two away from the beginning of the story of Joseph, and we'll stop there and then transport ahead towards the end of the book and look at Jacob after the return and the blessing of the sons. So we'll spend some time in there. And so I'm intentional about, as he's returning, what has he learned? I don't want to miss this, because I think this is such an important aspect in any man's journey. And so we're now in a series of there's three topics. There's calling, the content, and the conclusion, the three C's of this second giving of the promise by God at Bethel, same place. And I'm doing a comparison here. I'm looking at what was before in Genesis 28 and then what is now happening here in chapter 35. And so I don't want to miss this. And so today I'm going to do some short comments. And then last week I handed out a handout just for your information. And I've got extras if you don't have it. But I'd like to do some table time today and do some discussion and then do a wrap up. So I'm just going to make a few comments on this first aspect of calling, in 28, and then when Jacob was called to return in chapter 31, and then actually what is occurring here in 35. So why don't somebody read it, and then I'll make some comments, just so we're all on the same literal page here. 35, 9 through 15.
God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel, and God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give you the land to your offspring after you." Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel.
Good. Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Okay, so last time we were together, we ended up with this slide. And this is actually what's on your handout. I'll ask, for those of you who don't have those, just actually, how many of you do not have the handout? Here, I'll just Just pass. And so it looks cockeyed to me. I keep twisting my head. So in Jacob's life, what we've been looking at extensively in Jacob's life is what I think can be diagrammed very loosely as this ascending arrow, and it has to do with the calling to go out. First of all, the calling took place in the context of Jacob stealing the blessing. Jacob's life was in danger. His father brought him to him, blessed him, and sent him away. That's in chapter, that would be, I think, in chapter 26. I'm not sure. Could be 27. But then in 28, he comes to Bethel, and he has the dream of the ladder. The dream of Jacob's ladder. And he's clearly going out, and God is promising, I'm going to be with you, and so forth. And we're going to look at that more intensely in the next week when we look at content. And he goes out, he builds his life, and this 25 years of time transpires between that and when he receives the call from God. Again, the context of conflict in the family, where God says, now it's time, go return to the land. So go and return is what we're looking at, and it can be diagrammed by two arrows. One is an ascent arrow, one is a descent, and I put some bullet points on there which certainly correlate to Jacob's life, and they're part of the handout asking you guys to see, gee, where have I seen I'm calling them growth points. I don't know if that's really the term I want to settle on, but they're good enough for now. Is this that early on, this Jacob, as in any young man's life, it's important that he feels his power. He feels, and in the agrarian culture of times past, it was much more easy for a young man to know that, because he would actually have his hands on the production of both crops and husbandry. And it was all a part of seeing how the application of what I am doing has results, good results. And that's power. And then it comes to a point in his life of autonomy. That's what he's building towards, is this autonomy of being who I am, and in a sense creating some level of identity. That's important, because one has to have something before they can lose something. So there's got to be an identity. And then the governance piece is that how can I apply who I am to a larger perspective? And that's all natural, and that's all good. We all have to go through that. But that's not where we want to stay. If we're followers of Christ, we're called to something different than that. Something deeper, something more pronounced. Thus, the teachings of Jesus is the calling to descent. And what we do with that, it means everything, the kind of man we turn out to be. I would call this first half of life. I'd call this second half of life, or even the last third of life, where we come to a point where we learn to accept what is there instead of trying to control and change everything. There's a loosening of the grip that naturally occurs. We've seen this in Jacob. There's a releasing, and then there is actually new fruitfulness. I pointed out last week this correlation between the stories. Homer wrote the two great poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I've not read the Iliad, only synopsis. I've spent a great deal of time in the Odyssey, because it has to do with the subject matter that I'm very interested in. That's the second half of life. And Homer's character, Odysseus, follows this pattern. The whole story of Odyssey is how to get home. It's really how to return. That's the story. So anyway, that's all review. So what I want to what I want to look at is just some major bullet points in summary, and then we're going to give you guys some time to talk around the table. And so this is really the same thing we've looked at it in a much more concise, boiled down form. The first half of life in Jacob's example, and I think in our examples as well, I would say this is normative. This is generally true. It's about going out to build my world, going out this way of ascent. And the way of ascent, going, has everything to do with ascent, going up, building, figuring out what I'm going to do. You know, this was the weekend we did our. They're getting fewer for us. The graduation parties. You know, we're moving on to a different phase of life, but we did have one this weekend where we've got friends that actually have a graduate. Our friends are getting older now, so we don't do many graduation. We used to do 5, 6 a weekend, but that's not the case anymore. When I graduated from high school, Fort Collins High School, we didn't do all that. We didn't have that. I think parties were invented after I graduated. We didn't do that. So anyway, but going out, and of course the question to the graduate is, what are you going to do? Where are you going to go to school? And they have to answer that 1,000 different times. But that's all about this first half of life. This is all about, where am I going to go to college? Why did you choose John Brown University? And and they have to say that over and over again, and what the decision was. Well, it's all about building and who am I going to go through life with? The next step is meet someone and then then a career, and all these things are good. All these things are very good, but it's not where we want to stay, and it's not what the calling of us as men has to do with ascent, and ascent has to do with power. That key word there is power. Power is one of the key words I want you to remember, one of two. Power. It's all about power, at least in a male journey. Power. We live in a really interesting time because my observation is now, for years and years and years, men and women had distinctive roles in a culture. The men went out, the women basically stayed at home. But that has changed in our lifetime, and now women are really, many women are very, well, they're going out, and they're actually they are actually would fall into this. They've got to go through the same process as the males. If you're going to choose this journey, the journey is the same. So I'm not tying it to gender. I'm trying it more to a track in life, and that has been historically predominantly male. But in our culture, we're seeing some interesting things, and I would say the same applies. If you have to going to go through and make your mark in the world, you can there's the way of descent. It's going to happen. So anyway, so there's one, the arrow going up, and now return later, 25 years later in Jacob's life, is now his return, Genesis chapter 31, and to go back to the land. And of course, that just opened up all kinds of interesting stories that we have read about. The leaving of Laban and the posse and the catching up of Laban, and then this whole thing with his brother, facing the demons of the past and the wrestling with the angel. Oh man, these are great, great stories. And so he's returned, and now he's back. And return has to do with descent. Very, up arrow, down arrow. Very, pretty simple. And descent has to do with relinquishing power. There's the key. The first half of life is building, power, and the second half of life is learning how to let go of power. And we call it letting go. And then I would say this, that there's the two arrows, kind of a summary statement here, is that in between, during this time, our mid-years of life, in here, between the two, has everything to do, everything, between the two has everything to do with what a man does with his pain. So there's the second word. I think it boils down, men, is what do we do with power and what do we do with pain? It really turns out those two have a huge impact on the kind of men we turn out to be. What we do with power, or what is done to us with power, and what we do with pain. And that's all decided within this middle time of life. And so I'd like you guys to just work around your tables. Maybe Arthur, if you could join these guys and discuss this. You know, I handed those out and I didn't get any back. So yeah, I'll get it back. But on here is the basic chart, and it's a time of reflection, guys. And from our study of Jacob, can you think of examples? Think about Jacob first, how these growth points, these 6 points, I'm calling growth points, were illustrated through his journey. And then, you know, I'd like you to make an attempt to say, for you, in what ways have you seen these to be true in your life? How can you correlate and identify with these things? So let's do that for 10 minutes, and then I'll get you back together. We'll have a few closing comments. So enjoy that. And I'm going to shut off the video for today, and see you next week.